Welcome to the Awakened Heart Podcast. I'm your host, Nancy Walters. Get ready to create magic and miracles as you lean into your heart's desires. I believe not only does the heart want what it wants, but it knows. This show is a weekly deep dive into what it means to live from an awakened heart. I'll be sharing inspiring stories and real conversations with people just like you, who have turned the ordinary into the extraordinary. My mission is to show you how you too can be connected and heart-centered in every area of your life. Your journey to aligning with more love, more joy, and your wildest dreams come true starts now. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Awakened Heart Podcast. Now, we are finally in summer here. I think a lot of us who have come out of that long winter we had this past year, which dragged into May. And as a lot of my fellow Midwestern and Easterners know, it literally goes from winter into summer. And we're in full swing here, man. Got heat alerts all over the place. So with that, I think many of us, as these seasons change, we want to get outside more and have and feel more connection. And I know many of us are searching for ways to feel more connected to ourselves, to nature, and to something deeper than the busyness of everyday life. And summer is a perfect time for that, especially when it's so fleeting, especially as it is here. Sometimes that wisdom comes through books, teachers, or life experience, and sometimes it comes through slowing down long enough to listen. Today's conversation explores some of those themes. I'm joined by Jason Grechanik, a tabaquero who has spent more than 25 years studying and working with plants as medicine, including the past 15 years immersed in Amazonian traditions. What I enjoyed about this conversation is that we didn't just talk about plant medicine. We explored our relationship with nature, ancient wisdom traditions, consciousness, healing, and what it means to live in greater harmony with ourselves and the world around us. Jason brings a grounded and thoughtful perspective shaped by years of living, studying, and working in Peru, while also weaving together Amazonian tobacco traditions and Celtic tree wisdom. Jason is also the co-founder of Nicotiana Rustica, where he guides plant dietas that blend Amazonian traditions with local flora inspired by Celtic traditions. And he is the host of the Universe Within podcast. I hope you enjoy this fascinating conversation with Jason Grechanik. Hey, Jason, welcome to the Awakened Heart Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for having me.
And from one of my favorite cities in the world, Lisbon, what a wonderful place to live. As I was saying before we hit record, I just find it such a beautiful culture, the food, the vibrancy, the people. And I'm really thrilled to have you on here. Yes. So Jason, you've spent over 25 years working with plants as medicine. And a big part of that has been deep immersion in the Amazonian traditions. I'd love to start with what originally drew you to this world, because it's not a typical path.
Yeah, it's a good question. I really don't know, to be truthful. I've sometimes thought about it. Other people have asked me that question. I think as a kid, there was very few things I actually wanted to do. I think a lot of people knew from a young age what they wanted to do. I really didn't, because I think growing up in the U.S., none of the kind of standard options that were presented to me really resonated. I really love fighting, so I do martial arts, and I love that. I think growing up, that also didn't really seem like a very clear-cut path, although I think now that is. I liked acting, I liked movies, and then there was something that I couldn't really put into words, which probably as I grew up was something around this idea of shamanism. And I had quite a unique childhood in that my father really enjoyed traveling around the world to these very remote places, and especially at that time, 40 years ago or something. And so I think from a young age, I was exposed to a lot of cultures, what we may call indigenous cultures now. And I think there was something in that worldview, their way of being, really their way of being, that very much drew me to it. And there was something of a cosmology, a worldview, again, for lack of a better word, just a way of being that really intrigued me. And growing up, there really, again, wasn't a very clear cut path for that. But at some point, I became really interested in spirituality. And I started doing a lot of different practices from yoga to martial arts to Qigong to breath work and just kind of devouring books and practices. I was living in New York City, which was actually an amazing place to do that because kind of every system in the world was represented there. And eventually I left. I started traveling the world myself. And I think through a number of serendipitous events, I was eventually drawn to the Amazon. And before that, I had a very big interest in plants and plants as medicine through food, through herbalism, interested in things like European herbalism and traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, kind of these more holistic systems as I saw them of medicine. And eventually I had a very deep calling to go to the Amazon, specifically the Peruvian Amazon. And I think that really was quite revelational. It really opened up something that I was very much longing for, answers to questions that I was really searching for. And that kind of led me into a deeper exploration, self-exploration of a very unique and very beautiful, special way of seeing the world and specifically with working with plants.
And, where was it? Iquitos? Because I know a lot of people work with shamans up in Iquitos, and they learn ayahuasca, and they learn plant medicine from the elders and people that have practiced it for generations. Was that where you were, up in Iquitos?
For the most part, yes,
Yeah.
around that area. Also, there's another Peruvian city, Pucallpa. I spent time there, but yeah, most of my time, specifically in the Peruvian Amazon, was around Iquitos.
Well, you didn't just study this, you lived it, 4 years, like, over 15 years. What did the immersion actually teach you that you couldn't have learned any other way?
Well, I think that 15 years was a big part of that was spent in the Amazon. Some of that was also spent because Peru is quite unique in its geography, but also a portion of that was spent up in the Andes, which is also quite a different culture. But the majority of that time it was spent in the Amazon. And I was very fortunate in a way to work at a Shipibo plant medicine, specifically ayahuasca healing center that was quite well renowned called the Temple of the Way of Light. And that was a very immersive experience. It was really working, living hand in hand with a group of people called the Shipibo people who have a very deep ancestral knowledge of ayahuasca, of Amazonian plants. And then having the opportunity to work with countless people. We were working with groups of 23 people coming every basically 2 weeks. And so it was a very unique opportunity to just sit in ceremony. I mean, almost day in and day out. We were doing,
Wow.
I think, something like 7 ceremonies in the span of 10 days and just
With the same
constant.
people? With the same people
No,
or different groups?
rotating. So every 12 days was
Okay.
basically a new group coming.
That's a long time to work with a group, 12 days. That is an immersive experience. And then
It is. I mean, for some people, it probably seems very short. For some people, it seems like a never-ending amount of time. But yes, it was a very good and very deep immersive experience for people.
with different medicines that you used, or is it all Shipibo?
It was a Shipibo center, so it was all
Oh, it was all
working with Shipibo people. Most people came to work with ayahuasca because it's become a medicine that's quite renowned.
yes.
But even for the people and many people of the Amazon, ayahuasca is really seen as a gateway, a portal, something that opens one's visions, allows one to see, allows one to diagnose, and puts one in a certain frame, a certain state, we could say, of consciousness that allows a deeper healing to occur through all of the medicines of the jungle. So usually when even if you're sitting in an ayahuasca ceremony, there's many medicines being worked with, potentially not physically, but energetically via
Mhm,
all of the plants that have been learned from the people administering the plants.
mhm. For someone hearing the word tabaquero for the first time, how would you describe what that role really is beyond the label?
Yeah, it's basically a Spanishized, I don't know if that's a word, way of giving a title to someone. So, in the same way that someone who works with ayahuasca could be called an ayahuasquero, someone who specializes in tobacco would be called a tabaquero, someone who specializes in Chiricsanango, which is considered another master plant, would be a sananguero. So it's just denoting that someone has a particular knowledge of that plant. So a tabaquero is someone who has particular knowledge of tobacco. And tobacco is an interesting plant in that it's a plant most people are familiar with. I mean, even when I started this work, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, very few people had heard of ayahuasca. I mean, it wasn't in our vernacular, and now it is. Um, but tobacco is in our vernacular, interestingly, because it was probably the most widely used medicine in all of the Americas, amongst all of the indigenous or Amerindian peoples. And so because of that, it spread very quickly. And kind of when this old and new world met, again, for lack of better terms, because the new world is very, very old. Because it was so widely used, it was adopted by these foreigners, these immigrants, very quickly. And so it spread. And so even today, many people are familiar with tobacco through usually the act of smoking. But in the Amazon, really in all of the Americas, tobacco was considered a sacred plant. And for many people, probably most of the people, the most sacred plant. It was really seen as a gateway to the world of spirit. In a lot of traditions, you have these stories that the creator God gave tobacco to humans so that humans could dream like God dreamt the universe into creation. And so it has this idea. It's why it's often referred to as a plant of the shaman, because it allows one to have a foot in both worlds. And that was often the role of the shaman, to go into the spirit world, to receive information, knowledge, wisdom, and then to bring that back to his or people to guide them. And even if you look at maybe a more Western scientific worldview, tobacco is very much working in this hypnagogic state or this liminal space. So it's very much putting us in this dreamlike space where we're able to be much more open, perceptive to more subtle information. And so traditionally, tobacco also, probably most people, when you hear that, they think of smoking, but smoking is one of the ways tobacco can be applied, and actually not the most commonly way tobacco is worked with. The strongest is when it's ingested, like ayahuasca in the form of a tea, where really any sacramental medicine, you're ingesting it in this liquid form into the body. It can be smoked, it can be snorted with a powder, it can be snorted through the liquid, it can be chewed, it can be taken as a paste, it can be applied topically. So there's many ways that it can be worked with.
Mm. And I know that when I was doing ceremony, the shamans would they would blow tobacco constantly in the room, in our faces, and, yeah, it was pretty amazing, and I know how they have the feet in both worlds because everyone's going on these ayahuasca journeys or plant medicine journeys, and they have to be in this world and out of the world. It's pretty amazing how they work with the tobacco, and I never knew that it was ingested as well. And I have been hearing a lot of the healing properties. Of course, shamans have used it for years in ceremony. And then, of course, when it came in the cigarettes, the nicotine or the chemicals they use in it is what makes it really hazardous for people's health because of the manufacturing of it, right? There's a lot of healing properties in tobacco. And, I see a lot of it on social media as well. I forgot what ailment it could heal. There's a lot of things that it can heal physically in the body, a lot of diseases, a lot of ailments, or something that could help your health a lot. And it's pretty amazing what we have learned throughout the years. We have to unlearn for all these traditions and these medicines that have been used for millennia. And people like you are bringing it back, and people are seeking it out a lot more, it feels like. Do you find that a lot more people are seeking out these healing methods?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot I could speak about there. As I said in the beginning, these plants, like tobacco, like ayahuasca, they were considered sacred. And we tend in the West to be very good at reducing things, to isolating things, compartmentalizing things. And that's a beauty. There's a real knowledge to that. There's a wisdom to that. There's a beauty to that. And sometimes we begin to lose the wholeness of something. And so in these more traditional, older ways of working specifically with plants, it wasn't seen that something could be reduced to something so simple. You had the stories of the plants, you had the ceremonies of the
Mhm.
plants, you had the wisdom of the plants, the knowledge of the plants, the dietary restrictions, the worldviews, the rituals, and all of these things were seen as an integral part of the medicine. And when you begin to lose that, you begin to lose not only the power of the medicine, but you begin to lose some of the purity of the medicine as well. I think often for many people, we view things in this black and white way, like something is good or it's bad. Tobacco is bad or it's good. In the same way we view coca, like coca is bad because cocaine is made of it, or for a long time, marijuana was bad because someone said it was bad. But none of these plants are you know, can necessarily be looked at that way. I mean, they're ultimately good in a sense that they're given to us by the Creator, by God. They exist, therefore they're good. And tobacco is a plant, and no plant is bad. I mean,
Mm-mm.
even the most toxic plant in the world is not bad. It has a point. It has a medicine. Some of our strongest pharmaceutical medicine comes from what would be deemed very toxic plants, but like I think the 16th century Swiss physician Paracelsus said that the difference between medicine and poison is in the dose. And that's very true. And that's still a fairly reductionist way of looking at things because you also have the ritual, the medicine, the knowledge, the cosmovision, the song, the story. So, yes, for many, many years, tobacco was seen as an amazing plant. I mean, you don't have to go that far back in history to remember that. I mean, even in the early days of the US, where you're coming from, tobacco was
Mhm.
seen as a panacea in the same way that it was seen in traditional cultures, that it was a plant that could heal almost anything. And over time, yes, as you begin to lose the sacredness and a plant becomes more mundane and you lose the ritual, you lose the story, you begin to lose its medicine. And yes, like many things, like many plants, I mean, I think people are more familiar now with the toxicity of chemicals, of pollutants in the air and our water and our foods. I think there's a lot more knowledge of that. And so any plant, if you're growing it with artificial pesticides and herbicides um, and then on top of that, you're adding innumerable chemicals to it, depending on where you maybe get your research from, 600 or 1,000 or many thousands of added chemicals. And then you smoke that and you ingest it into your lungs over time. Of course, there's going to possibly be very real
600?
problems with that.
600 added chemicals, my god.
600 is the small estimate of added
My
chemicals in
god.
commercial cigarettes.
How
Yes.
I don't know how people put that in their body. Hmm.
So yes, but sometimes I would joke it's amazing that cigarettes don't kill more people. When you
Right.
think about all of the chemicals they're putting into their body. And then yes, to answer your question, are more people seeking these out? Absolutely. I mean, even as I was saying earlier, when I started working with ayahuasca, no one had any idea what I was talking with. Now you hear about it all the time. So certainly these plants are getting out and I think there's a symbiotic relationship as humans are suffering, as the planet is suffering. Nature is bringing these out. Nature, God, whatever our worldviews are. There's always a symbiosis. Nothing is ever out of harmony, which I think is one of the maybe the ailments we have of the human mind is we believe things are in a state of dysbiosis, but things are always in a state of symbiosis. It's just what is the state that we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where the water is toxic and our food is toxic and our programming is toxic and our thought patterns are toxic, where we feel disconnected and depressed and anxious and in a way that we've lost a deeper connection? And this isn't something new. When you hear a lot of these ancestral stories, they would say that even eons ago humans were suffering, and that ultimately the root of that suffering is because we as humans we've forgotten who we are and where we come from. And when we do that, we become disconnected, and then we see ourselves as separate, and we begin to treat others and other things and other life forms as separate instead of something that's interconnected. And so I think there's a real longing that people are having, and these plants are a very powerful gateway to reconnect to what could be said something more divine, of helping people to remember on a deeper level who they are.
It's the separateness from nature, which is there's harmony in nature. The plants, the animals, the sky, the water, it's all in harmony. We've lost that. We've lost the connection to that with all these Western living, even though people have suffered a long time. They've been so more focused on, I mean, I think over the last couple hundred years, especially in the Western society, we've been really separated from it. And I think we're being called back to a more natural way of living, more connection. We're not separate from everything that's around us. We've become so, as a human species, like we become so separate from everything else. And in the Western world, we're in our little homes, our little boxes, in our own little worlds. We're not having community. But nature, I find whenever I walk out and it just settles my whole system, I need to be connected to nature. And I after this next question, I do want to dive more into your work around trees because I got called back from California to Michigan. I lived in Oregon for a while as well, but I got called to the trees. And why don't we just dive into that question right now? I love how you weave Amazonian tobacco traditions with Celtic tree wisdom, which is really interesting bridge. How did these two paths come together for you?
As I was saying earlier, I spent a long time living in the Amazon, studying Amazonian wisdom traditions, and a lot of their work, even as I was saying, for example, ayahuasca, most people who work with ayahuasca, ayahuasquero, as they may be commonly called, usually the way that they do their work is through a knowledge of plants and experiential knowledge that they've gained through plants. Often traditionally it was called a dieta, where you go into isolation, fast, begin to develop a real relationship with the plant through the ingesting of that, often via the means of something like tobacco or ayahuasca for extended periods of time. So that's why I was saying, even in an ayahuasca ceremony, usually the person who's guiding that ceremony has a relationship with many plants, and that's their medicine that they're using to heal with. And very often those plants were trees. Trees were often considered the great teachers of the plant kingdom. They're the oldest plants. They're very symbolic in many ways, from the connection to the roots, the trunk, the branches moving towards the heaven. I probably talk a lot, but symbolizing past, present, future, the underworld, the lived world, the spirit world. The three aspects of ourselves, our body, our mind, and our spirit. And they have a lot of wisdom. And at a certain point, it was actually during the beginning of the pandemic, I moved out of the Amazon to where I was saying this area in the Andes, in the mountains of Peru. Even though it wasn't that far geographically, because of how Peru is, where you have the Amazonian basin and then begins to go up into the Andes, it's quite a different ecosystem, very different flora and fauna. And so we were somewhat removed from those trees that we had been working with. So part was beginning a new process of beginning to become curious, to discover, to work with local trees. And then we began, when I say me, it's myself and my colleague that I usually work with. We began getting invited to work abroad, especially during that time when it was very difficult to travel and for people to move during the pandemic. And I think the first place we ended up was New York, and it's very close to where I grew up. I remember sitting on this kind of patio one day under the trees and just feeling this dormant wisdom of all of these trees that I was familiar with, that I grew up with, but that I didn't have that same connection because I hadn't worked with them in that technological way that I had learned in the Amazon through this very ancient technology of bridging these connections, this more experiential way. And I felt, or I had this calling that all of these trees were really waiting to be worked with, to have their medicine re-brought back into the world, because certainly there was a great knowledge of that. And then also we were invited to Ireland, and in Ireland, I think we were very impressed, and that still, as we were saying, in this Western world, there were people who still, in many ways, shared a certain cosmovision of Amazonian peoples, where they would make offerings to plants, or they would make offerings to spirits or fairies, or there were certain rites or rituals that needed to be heeded to. And that even the ancient language, the Omum language, it's often said that every letter of that language corresponds to the name of a tree. So, for example, the letter D is dur, or which is oak, or H is hua, or hawthorn. So, even in their language, the language was built around a
Never
reverence of
knew that.
trees.
Never knew that.
Yeah, the physical medicine of trees, the spiritual medicine. And that's a lot where still European herbalism, I think, traces its roots to. I mean, much like many Western systems now, it's maybe focused more on a more allopathic, symptomatic way of treating. But in its essence, like all traditional systems, there was an element of spirit to it, connecting to the spirit of the tree, the wisdom of the tree to also heal. And so that was, I think, a beautiful bridge and connection of then taking this Amazonian technology knowledge of working with trees, but beginning to not move away from Amazonian trees because they'll always be part of us. But most of the people we're working with are not from the Amazon. They're from Europe. They're from the US or Canada or Australia. And so beginning to reconnect them to trees that are more present with them, trees that where people come from the same land, the same soil, the same history. And I think there's something really beautiful and profound. And part of that kind of calling that we were speaking about of coming back to our roots, to our traditions, to this act of remembering on a deeper level who we are.
Mm, it's really fascinating. That's amazing. And I would love to hear. So, when you work with people and they come to work with you and have these experiences, what do you find that they're usually seeking and what do they actually end up finding? Because a lot of times what they're seeking turns out to be something else that is shown to them.
It's a very good question, and I think you're very correct. For example, when I was working at the ayahuasca healing center, we would often have this idea of intention, like, what's your intention? Why are you here? And people usually they had quite clear ideas, or they would form an intention,
Yeah.
if nothing else, because they were often encouraged to. Um, there's a real difference between an intention and also an expectation of what I think is going to happen, because usually the root of the issues that people are coming to deal with are not rational issues. They're not issues that can be dealt with the mind. If the
Mhm.
mind could deal with them, then they wouldn't be coming. You could just answer all of your problems with your mind, and then we'd be good. But we've tried doing that, and usually we find that that doesn't necessarily work. And so usually these plants, they can have a very somatic approach. They can have a very visual approach. They can have an experiential approach. But usually, to some degree, they're bypassing the mind that thinks it knows, that tries to reduce, that tries to name, that tries to compartmentalize. And that's often what's needed, because it has to go to a place that's deeper, a place that's maybe dark in a way that we haven't seen, or we haven't touched on it, or that the light hasn't been shined. Something that's maybe in Western terms in our subconscious or unconscious even. And so, as you said, many people, probably the reason on a deeper level why they're coming is actually not so clear. That they may have a more surface level of, my back hurts, or I have irritable bowel syndrome and nothing helps, or I'm really depressed, or I'm anxious, or I feel disconnected, or my relationships aren't working, or I feel incomplete in my life, or I feel a lot of anger or resentment around my mother, my father, many different reasons. Some are very physical. People come with very very acute physical symptoms that they're looking to heal. I'd say probably a bigger portion. It's something around the realm of the mind, not feeling well, or anxious, depressed, negative thought patterns, negative beliefs. But on the deepest level, it's a spiritual disconnection, and ultimately that's where we begin working. Again, very often in our Western system, we look at things more from the ground up, that we start in the physical, like there's an imbalance, there's a chemical imbalance, or there's too much of something or too little of something. And so we're trying to bring that back into balance. to some degree, we focus on the mind. We have the fields of psychiatry, psychology. Even when I was growing up, I think those were seen as not medicine in a way, like that wasn't seen as something that was important. The body could be more reduced to more of a mechanistic way of being. If you simply ingested something, you could bring the body back into balance and that would heal you. I think today, a big shift has happened where even most Western medical doctors would acknowledge that there's a very deep mind-body connection. These things are not related. Um, but in our Western worldview, we usually don't speak in terms of spirit. Usually, spirit or religion is something apart, that it's a completely separate field, and it's not usually tied to health in any way. Although even on my podcast, I've spoken with a number of doctors who actually don't share that worldview, that they would say that the role of spirit has a big impact in people's well-being. In a lot of these traditional systems, we're actually working in the opposite way. We're working from the top down. And so it's seen that at the root, we have spiritual ailments, this longing, this sense of disconnect. And that as we begin to heal that, as we begin to bring that into wholeness, mind begins to come more into wholeness. And as our mind, our emotions begin to come more into wholeness, our body also begins to come more into wholeness. And so that's primarily also how we're working, is when people come to us, we're using our tools to diagnose where's the root of this, what plants can we use to help them, because also each of these plants, each of these trees is seen as a very specific acute teacher of something. And so the healing process is not in a way just ingesting something and our problems go away. It's taking us into an experiential process where we have to begin to also see, where are these things coming from? What's the emotional resonance? What's the patterning? Where are these coming from? How do I react to them? How do I deal with them? What are the possibilities? Because usually we're fixed in certain, what could be said maybe in, again, more Western terms, certain neuropathways, certain neurological conditions. And that by beginning to change those, to see other possibilities, we can begin to open ourselves to new possibilities, to new ways of being. And that each of these trees, each of these plants is a very, very particular, specific teacher in how to do that. So much like going to university, some things you would need to study social studies, some things you need to study chemistry or biology or mathematics. And so each of these trees has its speciality, its way of approaching the root of a problem. And then also going back to one of your other questions, as you were saying, even specifically tobacco, there's I think information now coming out about the potential benefits, not so much tobacco, but specifically of nicotine, which is one of the alkaloids in tobacco. Although again, there's many. I mean, tobacco is one of the most chemically complex plants on earth, maybe the most, which is why it's considered so sacred. So again, to reduce it to nicotine, I think is a bit short-sighted. But nicotine is one of the very powerful alkaloids in tobacco. And there is a lot of research, and maybe what you were referring to, in that there is a lot of kind of information now that's circulating about the benefits of nicotine. And most of that is actually focused around this idea of neurogenesis, neuroplasticity. And so there's been a lot of research in neurological conditions.
Mm-hmm.
The rejuvenation of that, and conditions where there may be a deficiency or an imbalance of that, multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's, or anything that's affecting our neurology. And most things are affected by that. It's those things can only be left out of balance. Those are usually more acute or chronic conditions, but it could also be seen that many of our ailments come from these stagnant neuropathways. These even in other traditions, for example, in Vedantic traditions, this idea of Maya, that a big fundamental part of our suffering is because we see the world through a veil. We see the world through a lens of these patternings. In a Christian sense, it would be this idea of the apocalypse, which is very often mistranslated. Apocalypse, it's the same idea as Maya. It means to lift the veil, to see the world as it actually is. It's not the end of days, it's the end of the illusion of time. And
Yes.
so these plants are beginning to help us to do that.
Yes. Yes. So give me a lot to chew on there. Um, yeah, maybe it was nicotine in regards to, like you said, neurological conditions. My mom has Alzheimer's, so something along those lines. And I thought something about COVID as well. something about the virus that was out there. It was supposed to help with that. And of course, they
Tobacco
try to,
traditionally is a very strong antiviral.
yeah.
It's been used for probably thousands of years. I mean, maybe not spoken of as an antiviral, but as an antiviral. So again, tobacco, much like these sacred plants, is considered a panacea in a way, depending on how it's worked with. It has many ways of curing. But yes, also specifically for COVID, there's also been a lot of, I don't know about a lot, but there's been some research into the antiviral effects specifically for COVID,
Hmm.
and many, also many trees, many plants, um, not just tobacco, but um, again, it's a bit hard for people to also now shift their worldview that a plant that has been demonized could be actually beneficial. In the same way of something like marijuana, for many years, marijuana was demonized. But, that's where often we begin to lose the story because I think in the same way that now marijuana for many years was, then the opposite began to happen. It was seen as a cure-all and there's no negative effects whatsoever. That's also not true. I think states where they legalize marijuana are finding that when it's worked with what could be said improperly or without wisdom, people can have psychoses. They can have death, usually not from toxicity, but from a certain dizziness, a certain state that it can put them in, where they jump off of a building or
Hmm.
so. And that's true with any plant. It's the same with ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is not without its harms if it's
Right.
worked with improperly.
That's
Tobacco is not without its harms. So it's very important to understand the medicine so that it can be worked with to maximize its effects.
Yeah, and I've heard of people doing ayahuasca. Like this kind of thing needs to be done sacred in ceremony, especially ayahuasca. Like, and I've heard about them taking in parties in a back room in a club with no supervision or no guidance. I can't even imagine something like that. It's not something to be taken just recreationally. I really value the ceremony around it and the sacredness around it. And I know going back to all these experiences that you create in ceremony, these people come and spend 12 days working with you and the trees and the plants and learning the Shipibo traditions. And it's such a beautiful, immersive experience. And when I was doing ayahuasca was show me who I become. And then you just let the plant medicine show you because a lot of people go in there thinking one thing and you're going to be healed in other ways that you didn't expect because our conscious mind doesn't know what our subconscious knows. Of like you said, we'd be healed already because we'd be able to think our way out of whatever was ailing us or whatever was emotionally disturbing us. So you work with all these people, they have these amazing transformational experiences, and then there's integration that happens. How do you help people take these experiences and actually integrate them into their everyday lives, not just to keep them as something that happened in ceremony?
It's a good question. I think certainly this idea of integration has become much more spoken about. I think even when I started, it wasn't spoken about so much. It's a tricky thing. Integration, it means to make whole, and that's what we're all trying to do. And there's not necessarily a straightforward path to do that. We're going to fall, we're going to make mistakes, we get back up. There's certainly time-tested ways that can be beneficial, and I think that's part of the idea of honoring wisdom, honoring traditions, is that we can stand, like Isaac Newton said, on the shoulders of giants to see further than others have seen. We don't have to start from scratch. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. At the same time, we're all completely unique. There never has been another Nancy Walters. There never will be. There's never been a Jason. It was the same. There never will be another one. So there's no clear path for any of us. These plants give us a tremendous amount of wisdom. They can heal us. They can open us to new possibilities. And then they ask a certain responsibility, which is to go and to live that life. Usually I think when people speak about not integrating it's very often when one, the plants haven't been worked with properly. Usually, when they're worked with properly, integration begins to happen. It's not that it's easy or that we don't go through peaks and valleys. All of that is going to happen, but we're at least we're left in a state where we have the potential to begin to integrate. Having resources, having community. It's a big endeavor that a lot of, again, for lack of a better word, words Western people come and immerse themselves into a particular cosmovision, a worldview, which is what this is. That's why it's very difficult to isolate something like ayahuasca outside of its cosmovision, because there's so many things around that worldview. So, for example, something that can happen is someone goes and has an experience with ayahuasca, but they don't have a way to understand that on a deeper level. In the same way that if I went to China and people were speaking to me in Mandarin, it would be very difficult for me to integrate that fully, because there would be so many little pieces that I wouldn't fully understand. And that's the same with all of these. These plants, you know, they treat everyone equally in a way. Like anyone can come to these plants and have amazing experiences. But traditionally, you would also have a support system, people who could help to understand them, to understand what was happening, maybe why it was happening, how to work with that, how to deal with what was coming up. And often when that's not there, that's where problems begin to arise. And it's something that's happening a lot. It's maybe something that's not spoken about enough, is in the same way with marijuana, because marijuana is also a very, very strong plant, a very strong spiritual plant. And that's why people can have psychoses when it's worked with in a very strong way. In the same way with ayahuasca, usually that comes when people don't have a support system. They don't have a context. They don't have someone there to help them to walk them through that experience, to translate that experience, to understand that experience. And so then in a way they're an orphan. And that idea that we're orphans, again, is a very ancient idea that goes to the root of our suffering, is because we don't have that hand to help to hold us, to walk us home. These plants can be a very, very big teacher. And for all practitioners, that's part of our work, is to help people do that work in the best way, to give them context, to give them knowledge, to allow them to have the tools to best be able to integrate that experience. And everyone's ultimately going to have to do that on their own, because that's also part of our path. Um, Even I remember very clearly when I finished my apprenticeship with my teacher of tobacco, who actually wasn't Shipibo. He's what most people would call a mestizo, a mixed person. But it was very sad, because after this kind of extended training, he looked at me and he said, I've taught you everything I can. Wherever you go, buy a book, find a resource of local medicine, and start working. And part of me was like, well, there's still so many questions I have. Like, I don't know anything. Um, but it was very necessary and very profound. And I'm sure on a deeper level, he knew that was also my path, was then to go and begin bridging these medicines. And that, had I always been by his side, I never would have done that. And so it's scary to go out on our own. Um, and we need to be prepared to do that. So, it's always a balance. Like you're saying, these medicines can be worked with recreationally. There's not inherently something wrong with that, but a lot of problems can arise from that. Beautiful things can potentially arise from that too. But usually that's why these plants were worked with in a very sacred way, to mitigate those, to give us the wisdom, the knowledge, the tools to then go forth and I think ultimately spread the wisdom of these plants. It's an analogy that I use a lot. When you look at a tree, it provides so much medicine. It's fruits, it's bark, it's leaves, it's roots, it's the shelter, the shade, the actual wood itself. And on a deeper level, each of these trees has a knowledge, and we become a seed. In the same way, when the seed of a tree falls to the ground, it propagates, or a bird takes that seed and spreads it. And we as humans have that same potentiality to spread the wisdom of these trees. But to do that in a proper way, we also have to be rooted. Much like that tree, we have to be grounded in a tradition. We have to be strong in our trunk, and we have to have a connection to the spirit world. And then if we do that, we can really spread that knowledge and wisdom in a beautiful way.
Hmm, I like that. Having roots, roots, and just the wisdom of the trees. It gives so much to us, the shade, the seed for the birds, and I can just feel that energy when I'm in the woods and the trees, especially in Oregon. Like it was almost like being in a tropical forest is just like a rainforest. It was pretty magical with the moss and the green, and it was beautiful. And I like what you said about how you help people after these experiences to integrate. Like you can offer the tools and context and the community. I'm sure you have some kind of community they can connect to after, but a lot of the work is up to them. They have to do the work themselves and be ready to integrate this. Like your teacher had said. like you're like, "Oh, he just like it's for you to figure out." Yeah, I love all that. And I would love to, I know that you're a husband and a father and you live a very grounded life. I'd love to hear, how has this path shaped the way you show up for those roles as husband, father, and the life that you live right now?
It's a very good question. One of the I remember we were sitting, myself and my colleague, in a ayahuasca ceremony, and we had a Q&A, and some people started asking us about relationship advice, and we kind of looked at each other and laughed because we were both single and living isolated in the Amazon, that we were not the best people to be answering that question. At the same time, I think a fundamental part of working with any of these plants is about relationships, because it could be seen that all of life is about relationships, the relationship to ourself, relationship to our family, our friends, our parents, our loved ones, our work, to water, to air, to earth. In this dualistic world, everything is relationship. It's duality. So there's an energetic in all relationships. I think one of the things in that's where, again, cosmovision, I think, can be quite important, and often, I think less so now, but especially early on in this work, a lot of people equated practitioners of this work to maybe this kind of Eastern guru type of sitting alone, meditating in a cave and disseminating knowledge. But as I mentioned earlier, the traditional role, at least in the Amazon, and I think in cultures all over the world, of the shaman, the wisdom keeper, was to go into these spaces and then come back to his people, his or her people, and share that information. So it was a role of the people, and so it's a very mundane role also in that, and about having relationships and community, um, and we all come from a mother, from a father, and this is a big part of our work. And for those of us who choose to take that role, that's also something we begin to pass down. I think on a more subtle level, all of the work I've done has been preparing me for that. And I don't know that it makes it any easier. Honestly, it's these are big things in our lives. I mean, so much, when people speak of this idea of, like trauma, for example, has become a very popular word in these spaces. And many people have trauma, and often they relate their trauma to childhood experiences, very, very often to their parents, or even when people are older, they experience trauma vis-a-vis their love life and their love relationships. And so these are things we always have to work on. I think ultimately these plants help to give us wisdom, and they help to do these things in a better way, to understand them in a wiser way. And each of these roles for all of us is embarking on a new journey. And for sure, we fall, we make mistakes. But I think as a practice, it gives us a certain framework, a certain worldview to come back to. And even personally, for example, the role of being father, it was something I think that I was a bit afraid of, because it just seemed like a huge responsibility. How does someone do that in a good way? And then there's just something that begins to become very natural about it. You, like everything, you begin to put one foot in front of the other, and you just start to do it. And I think you draw from a place of maybe strength that you didn't realize you have. And then it also becomes a tremendous gift, just a huge gift to see a human being created and
Mm.
formed and shaped and exposed to the world, and seeing the world again through the eyes of something so innocent and pure. So it's been a huge beauty and honor, and also challenge. It's a huge endeavor, and especially because a big part of my work is caring for people.
Yes. And it's such a big, big change because when they ask in that ceremony, asking you and your partner about relationship and you're like, "Oh, we're alone. We're isolated in the Amazon." And then you meet your wife and then you have a child and just now you have this family and bringing everything that you do and you learned into this, but nothing prepares you for being a father and seeing this miracle that you created grow. Do they come travel with you sometimes? I know that you travel internationally teaching, and do they get to go with you to some of these if you're gone for an extended period of time?
Yeah, it's something where, as a personally, I am still trying to work out the best way, and as a family, we're trying to work out the best way. Sometimes these retreats, these ceremonial spaces can be quite intense, and so
Yes.
there's also a certain level of protection or trying to isolate my family from it, not only physically but even more so energetically. Um, and at the same time, it's very important for us to be together as a family. So it's a balance of how do we dance with
Mhm.
that? How much kind of meshing of those two roles is there, and how much do I expose my son to? He's still very young. He's almost 2 years old, so he's still a bit young, I think, for this work. But yeah, but it will be, I think, a very interesting journey for me as well. Like, how do I introduce him to this?
Yes.
It's big questions, but yeah, it's a big part of our journey is figuring out how to do that the best way. And certainly, it's also made me. We've had to begin to also travel less. We're starting to
Mhm.
work more remotely, finding other ways of working because traveling it's a big energetic expense, financial expense,
Yes.
but especially for a family, being able to be on the move like that, it can be tricky.
Well, I love everything that we talked about. Just a few more questions before we go, because I know you have this podcast, and I actually love the name of your podcast, The Universe Within. It just says everything. I know in this podcast you explore consciousness and human experience. What feels most important for people to understand about themselves right now?
I think the main reason I started the podcast, it was also during COVID, when I moved out of the jungle. I think I shot the
Yeah, that's
first
when I
episodes
started
in the
mine.
jungle.
Oh, okay.
In the jungle, I had no internet, so obviously
Lucky.
I couldn't do the podcast, but I shot a few episodes, and then when I moved to a place where there was, I began publishing it. It was really to give voice to, because I saw this field very much expanding. I mean, even in the time that I had worked, it was a much different energy from when I started to where it was at the end, and I felt at that time there was a real paucity of voices who were speaking from a really deep place, a place where they had really lived and experienced these plants and medicines and traditions. And so to give voice to those people, I was fortunate in that I worked with many people, many different colleagues, many voices that I thought that had wisdom and something to share.
Yeah, the consciousness and the human experience. What feels most important for people to understand about themselves right now? About consciousness or the human experience, like we had talked about, a lot of people are so disconnected right now. What could help them outside of going to your experiences? What can help them in their life right now to understand?
A good question. Um, I think, like I was speaking about that idea of relationships, that all of life can be seen as a relationship, and so a big part of life is these relationships we cultivate. It can be with friends, it can be with family, it can be with children, it can be with our work, it can be with our artistic creativity. These are all fundamental pillars that we also help people to reconnect with. I think the one you said is something very very important, and um, a big part of our suffering, which is our disconnect from nature. Um, you know, we can only be disconnected from nature for so long before we suffer. As I was saying earlier, we can only drink polluted water so much. We can only eat tainted food for so long. Um, we can only experience so many different frequencies and electromagnetic frequencies and stress and all of these things before we begin to suffer. Uh, Probably, as you know, according to the statistics, however much we believe those, but this apparently is the first generation, at least in the U.S., and I would imagine it's going to be similar worldwide, where the generation has a lower life expectancy than their parents. I think that comes from that disconnect. We live amazing lives in the Western world. We have access to everything. I mean, it was crazy for me coming back to the Western world where you just order everything on Amazon. And
Hmm.
even I remember getting in a car that I rented for the first time, and there was beeps and sounds going off when you went over the white line, or when a car was next to you, or you backed up and there was a camera that showed you. All of those things are amazing. At the same time, I think there's a system overload of because of the convenience, we lose connection. We can become more isolated. We can become more self-reliant, which is ultimately a good thing, to have that ability to have that choice, but then to also choose to have these relationships. And we're human beings, but we're animals in a beautiful way, not in a negative way of that saying, that we're also part of nature. Um, Water has a tremendous ability to heal. The earth, the soil has a tremendous ability to heal. Trees have a tremendous ability to heal. Animals have a tremendous ability to heal. The sun has a tremendous ability to heal. Um, and I think that's something we've forgotten. It's easy, living in a city or somewhere, to forget about that, to become lost in the human world. And that's a beautiful thing about cities, is they're places full of human spirit. And so to learn about human spirit, to feel human spirit, to experience human spirit, they're these magnificent places to do that. But most cities are now very disconnected from nature. And, the human realm is only one realm. Um, and if there's an imbalance and an excess of the human realm, then we're in imbalance. We're in a dysbiosis. And so I think we really have to honor all of these realms: the human realm, the realm of nature, the realm of spirit. And we have to some degree, spend time in those realms. And to the degree we don't, that's the degree to we suffer. And so a lot of people, I think, are feeling that, and feeling called to traditions or practices or ways of being, or even maybe in a more extreme form, going back to the land, living on the land, growing their own food, because these are intangible things, invaluable things that really help people to connect. Even the founding fathers of our beautiful country, they look to nature. They look to nature in the same way that the indigenous, the Native American people, look to nature for wisdom. That it wasn't seen that the ultimate wisdom came from a book or from a theatrical play. All of those things can be beautiful. There's tremendous knowledge in books, but that ultimately all of those things pale in comparison to nature, because nature is primordial. It exists before um, that act of manifestation. And, that's where all of these things are paradoxical. The act of creation that humans have the ability to do, that act of free will, that act of creation, is the biggest gift that we have, and the most power we have. And so always it's some dance between these two polarities. And that's why, in many ways, life is so complex and so simple at the same time, is we always are dancing between these polarities. And much like this question of integration, life is about trying to find a balance of
Hmm.
of this dance. And there's no answer that we can read in a book. Um, but through, I think, time and nature, we can begin to have a deeper experiential understanding of that.
Hmm. So well said. And I know there's this big push for 15-minute cities, making it sound, oh, this is so wonderful. You can do everything within your little 15 minutes. You can do everything, and like putting us all into these city centers and keeping, it reminds me of some of these dystopian shows like Divergent or something, where the outside and nature are left for other people besides us. I would die. I am like, you can't take me away from my trees and my woods and my forests. And you had talked about the founding fathers, how like the foresight to, like, New York City, it's a concrete jungle. But the foresight to put in a park, Central Park, and have parks everywhere, and every city in the world to have some kind of green space was so important for people back there. And thank God they did that, because I know that there's been pushes to develop all those areas. But can you imagine the emotional regulation and the mental balance of people without having some kind of nature within their city center. So, what I would love to hear before we wrap this up, what does it actually mean in your experience for someone to come back into alignment with themselves?
Yeah, alignment is often something we speak of. I think in a lot of these ancient traditions that they speak of, to be aligned. In the same way, it means that idea of integration, to be made whole. Same etymological root as health, wholeness, integration, alignment. Usually, when we speak of alignment, we're speaking of this idea of aligning our body, mind, and our spirit. And so, when someone is aligned, uh, they're healthy, they're whole, they're happy. That's also the symbology of a tree. A tree has those three parts. It's aligned, its roots, its trunk, its branches are aligned. They're connected, and when we're not aligned, that's where we have imbalance. You referenced the shipibo. Some people may be familiar with them, and they have these beautiful. They're called kana. These kind of intricate weavings of all of these geometrical patterns. It could be seen that ourselves, when we're imbalanced, these patterns are asymmetrical or there's pieces missing. And so part of their work is to weave these patterns back into being so that they're beautiful, so that they're symmetrical, so that they're whole. And this is this idea of alignment, of aligning these aspects of ourselves. And to the degree that we can do that, that's the degree that we can flourish.
Hmm. Sounds beautiful. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I would love for my audience to know people that would like to come work with you, where to find you on social, your website. And I know you're the co-founder of Nicotine. How do I say that? Nicotine. I'm bad at
Dana Rustica, yeah.
how do I say that? Or you say it. You tell us about all that you offer.
Yeah, if people are interested in working with me, my website is nicotianarustica.org. It's the Latin name of tobacco, and
Okay.
specifically the variety of tobacco we work with. So they can check out my website. Also, my Instagram is pretty active. It's just at my name, Jason Grechanik. And then I have a podcast, which is called The Universe Within, and you can find that on all the major platforms, YouTube and Spotify and Apple. So I think any of those are good ways to find me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for coming on the Awaken Heart podcast. One last question. I would love to hear from you. What does it mean for you to live with an awakened heart?
Question. Um, I think that's the essence of all of our paths, is to awaken our heart. We spoke a bit about this idea of the mind and the power of the mind, the beauty of the mind. But it was interesting in ancient Egypt. Apparently, when they were mummifying people, they just threw away the brains, but they preserved the heart. And we give a lot of power to the brain, to rational thought, but I think we often forget about the heart. And from my experience, that's why the heart was so revered. In ancient Egypt, for example, it's why if you wanted to enter the kingdom of heaven, your heart, of all of the organs, it was your heart that had to be weighed on a scale, and it had to be lighter than a feather, meaning it was purified. All of the anger, the frustration, the traumas, the doubts, the judgments, all of those things had been purified. And in a Christian sense, that's why Jesus was represented by the heart that's on fire, because it had been purified, it had been awakened. And I think that heart is the thing that connects us to all of life, and that ultimately all of our work here on this planet is very much to do that, to awaken our heart so that we can truly be a human being, so that we can truly experience all there is to this life. And I
Mm,
think it's the most noble path any of us.
I love that. That's so beautiful. And the image of Jesus with a heart. And yeah, it's symbolic of him and awakening himself to his heart. And then Egypt, I didn't even think about that, how they saved the heart. Yeah, yeah, beautiful. Yeah, the heart is revered. And then when you combine the mind with the heart and have that coherence, you've got the universe at your fingertips. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Everybody, I'm going to put all your information in the show notes, and I hope everyone comes and finds you and works with you, plugs into your podcast, and visits your website and immerse themselves in all that you offer. So thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your evening there.
Oh, thank you very much, Nancy. You have a beautiful presence, and it was
Thank
really
you.
just a great experience. And thank you for the work you're doing of sharing. I think it's very beautiful and important, and very much a calling for the time. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Awakened Heart Podcast. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, share it with a friend. And if you haven't already, head on over to your favorite podcast app to subscribe, rate, and review. If you have any comments, questions, or feedback, you can reach me at theawakenedheartpodcast.com.